Yes, this is a practical outworking of our high value of friendship, both as a theological category, but also as a strategic value that we put friendship and relationship first. So it's more important that we are friends together, friends with Jesus, and therefore, because of Jesus, friends with each other, doing something together than just getting a task done. And so, we try and express that. Even when the way we do meetings, we try and express the fact that we are friends together. And so therefore there is, there's a levity to the meeting sometimes. There is joyfulness, there's sharing of life together.
A lot of jokes.
It can be food. There's lots of ways that we can express that we are here to be friends together, and this is going to sound really cold, but utilising the friendship in order to get the task done. But
wow.
to strip the
that seems very utilitarian.
Yeah, I know.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Shock Absorber podcast, and I'm excited as always to be along this. We need a different word for a journey, Tim. What do you think? Welcome, Tim.
Hi.
What do you think we should do for a journey? I keep going to say journey, but we need something different.
Adventure.
You said adventure before.
No,
we need a different one.
Sorry, I wasn't ready for the cold open.
Sorry, I apologise. Hello, Stu. How are you?
Oh, good.
That's good. Any ideas for journey, adventure? What else are we? Discovery?
Oh, yeah.
Exploration.
Excursion.
I like that word.
Excursion.
Excursions are good. They always get me excited.
Oh, do they?
Yeah.
Why?
Oh, I just think about having my peanut butter sandwich in a little paper bag and my popper juice in the back of my bag and an apple, and then getting on a bus and going somewhere that's really, really boring.
Yeah,
but somehow it's really exciting because you're on the bus and you're not having to go to school. But then you end up in some museum and you just sort of like get given this piece of paper and a pencil and you have to write down things that you see.
Oh, wow.
That's what I think of an excursion.
Yes.
1970s Australian excursions.
I remember we did one in high school that went to the Bait Bay, the whole area of where Cronulla is and stuff. And it was just about sand and erosion.
And you have to find little crustaceans and draw the puddles and stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty boring. Anyway, speaking of museums, have you ever been to the Met, guys? Because we're looking at the Met Gala this morning.
I've seen it from the outside, but I didn't go in.
Yes, I did go in there once, which was... I went in there with my wife. We were in New York in 2013, and we barely scratched the surface. I don't think that we're there for hours. It's a huge place. But the thing that we're focusing on this morning is the Met Gala recently, where Sarah Paulson is the name of the actress, and there's plenty of celebrities get invited or go along to this. What do we call it? Fancy do at the Met Gala, and she's caused quite a bit of controversy wearing a $1 bill across her eyes like a blindfold, and kind of taking the same line of what would you call it? They're trying to protest? I don't know what the right word is. Same way as that AOC wore that tax the rich dress at the Met Gala. It was almost 5 years ago, kind of doing the same thing. And because Jeff Bezos was the co-chairman of he's a multi-billionaire, as you may know, Tim.
Frequently keeping up with Jeff Bezos's pocketbook.
Well, you probably buy a few products from his company, Amazon.
I try to avoid it at all costs, but occasionally it's required.
Because it's so efficient anyway.
Well, they're the only stockists.
What did you say? Oh, stockists.
Stockists, the only place you can find the particular thing you're looking for.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
So
there's a convenience.
Right, it's very convenient. What I'd like to ask you guys is, there is some critique and backlash against it, saying it was tone deaf and that a celebrity who earns millions of dollars as a film star is protesting against another rich person not being taxed enough. Tim, what are your first thoughts on this? Is it tone deaf?
Well, yes, I think so. I think there has been some argument to try and justify that was the whole point, was to protest the rich while in amongst the rich in a way that people who are not at the event and therefore can't access the event are not able to. But yes, I think it falls a little bit flat, not knowing her own tax files and how much she pays and how much she offshores, or all the different ways that you can get around paying tax. And I think this is part of the problem for those who are more like us, a little bit more middle class, working class pay packets, is those who are ultra rich can afford the tax agents to get them even less tax and know all the tricks in the trade. And there was even one podcast episode I was listening to recently where with a kind of a sarcastically saying that for a number of particular class or higher paid people, salary is for suckers, because there's so many other ways to actually have money and to get the things you want without taking salaries.
So you don't get taxed.
So you don't get taxed. Right. So yes, you can sort of legally take a salary, in inverted commas, that is just on tax rate, but there are all these other things open to you as someone who has, multi-millions or particular business acumen or whatever it is, to essentially be a millionaire without it being a millionaire on paper. And I think the frustration comes from the fact that, those who are stuck with it like a sucker with a salary with a pay packet that is and living paycheck to paycheck, could get frustrated that there's all these opportunities not open to the normal person on the street. So yes, I think there is some hypocrisy there you can kind of play around with, I think.
So someone that supposedly owns millions of dollars signals that the rich are the problem, but the average person, like you're saying, well, you are the rich.
Yes, you I mean, if you're got a net worth of $12 million or whatever she's worth, you are part of the 1%, well and truly. So complaining about the 1% when you're in the 1% feels less than honest, I think.
What do you think, Stu? Just join the tone deafness brigade?
Yeah, I think so. I think it seems to me that there are millionaires complaining about the billionaires. So I think they seem to be saying, it's the billionaires who are the super rich who should pay more. Seems to me that our art in the West has always had a social conscience. There's always been poetry and music and movies and books that have presented social themes to highlight injustices in different generations. One of my favourite examples within Australian literature is a book called Working Bullets by Catherine Susanna Pritchard, for example. She wrote a book about the log cutters in south-west and Western Australia who worked in the kauri forests, and she was actually a communist, and she wrote that out of her social context as a social justice piece, and it had a big impact on broader Australian society at the time, even outside of communist areas. And people were at the time thinking through the whole union movement that was an early version of which was birthed in Australia, the union movement. The Labor Party also came out of the 1800s. So around the turn of the century, there was a lot of people who were looking at the negative aspects of industrialisation and how the poor were living under terrible working conditions and low pay and things like that. But that strikes me as a different example, because that was about a working class person who happened to have a good education, who was speaking out of her context. If you fast forward, say, through to the 1960s, for example, and you see a lot of the protest songs of people like Bob Dylan and that cohort with a lot of the anti-war context of a lot of the music that came out of the 60s, or there was a lot of civil rights themes coming out of that kind of era as well. But with people like Bob Dylan, he emerged from within a youthful generation to speak at injustices he felt his parents' generation had put on themselves. So, fast forward to now, and I think you've got some very rich artists who are getting on a bit of a social bandwagon to, probably in good conscience, trying to use their profile to be helpful to others. But it does, I think, strike me as a bit tone deaf with the Met Gala, having people who can, in some cases, afford $100,000 tickets and wearing a $100,000 dress to then turn around and say that other people should be taxed more than, I think it's a bit tone deaf.
Do you think, I wonder about this, do you think it maybe was a strategic ploy? Like, we know that certain public figures kind of sometimes hide themselves and then announce themselves with a big bang of some, whatever it is. I think about Robert Greene, who's one of my favourite authors in the 48 Laws of Power. Law 6 is court controversy at all costs, so you can get the attention that you deserve. Do you think there's something in that? Do you think that's what Sarah Paulson was trying to do?
Well, I mean, I don't want to assume any motivation on her part, but certainly a number of these pieces do. I mean, again, the point of being a celebrity is your worth is in how much name recognition you get and how much, in this sense, controversy you create. And because that is, a lot of celebrities fall into the no news is bad news, or whatever that phrase is. So yes, I mean, controversy definitely helps as long as it's at a certain level. Obviously there are cancelable offences, and there's been a whole lot of politics around that in the last decade or so. But largely, these kinds of things just tend to boost people's profile in a positive way most of the time. So yes, I think that's true. It's interesting thinking about that idea from Robert Greene, court controversy at all costs. I'm just starting to filter that through a Christian lens and wonder about what does that actually mean and what does that look like. Obviously, I don't think Robert Greene is a Christian, and he's certainly not trying to raise people in biblical kingdom ethics. But it's interesting to consider that in the context of what we are seeking to form in the church and as disciples of Jesus in terms of virtues, but that's probably a different conversation. That's just where my brain went.
Stu, you mentioned just before about Francis Schaeffer's kind of model, whether it would come influence on culture would come. Was it artists first, then philosophers, or philosophers first?
He looked at the history of thought through the prism of philosophers, who then are popularised through artists, who then popularise the philosophy that then gets picked up by institutions. So I think that's broadly how that works. Some of our listeners might want to comment on that and give a more precise definition. For example, we had Dave on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. He's way more au fait with Schaeffer's work than I am, so he probably might be able to make a comment if you're listening, Dave. But I think there's that general flow.
And how do you think that influences kind of what we're talking about here, about the tax the rich and blinded by money, this kind of courting attention at all costs? Where do you think that comes from? Is there any idea in terms of taking Schaeffer's framework?
That's a whole podcast, but I think you can look back to. Sometimes I think this is still part of what some people call the whole woke agenda, I suppose. There was a lot of thought that came out in the 70s that then influenced the social action that we see today, that came from sociologists and philosophers that have then been popularised by artists in the 2010s. I think popularised in movements like the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter movement. Hip-hop picked up a lot of those themes. Even some of the, Beyonce I think probably would be a good example of someone who championed some more of the gender rights kind of stuff. Taylor Swift did, yeah. So then you've kind of got a lot of the confluence of a lot of those movements during the 2010s leaking into the 2020s. But I think there seems to be a bit of a change in the broader culture around some of that stuff. But I think the whole idea of taxing billionaires, and some of that is caught up with the new environmentalism as well, where there's a call in Australia for the liquid gas industry to pay more tax, for example, because people are saying they're making a huge profit. Some areas of society are criticising how much they pay tax. Some people are saying, Australia gets more revenue from the beer companies than it does from the gas industry. But I think they've only just looked at one section of what the gas industry pays rather than the overall taxes they pay probably. But yeah, there's a lot of controversy around that as well. It seems like there's a lot more attention at the moment on these billionaires like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos. These guys are incredibly wealthy. So there seems to be there's always been incredibly wealthy people, but there are individuals now that are probably the richest human beings that have ever lived. And so I suppose as a society, we're trying to grapple with a bit of that as well.
Do you think it also speaks to a wealth inequality as well? That feel like that gap is widening?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of talk about that in Australia too, with housing prices. And, the next budget that comes out is going to be really controversial, because I think the Albanese government's going to be taxing investors
capital gains
more,
tax.
and capital gains tax and other measures, which is really sometimes being seen as an attempt to help younger people get a house. So there's this maybe false impression. I don't know enough about it. I haven't read enough about it, but some people see it as a tax on boomers so that Gen Z can actually get into the housing market, that kind of idea. But then people who've paid the tax all their lives and have been putting into super all their lives so that they don't have to have a pension, and are thinking to themselves, I'm not actually putting any pressure on the state because I'm self-funded retiree, and now getting cranky because they're like, well, no one told us that all this money we put into these investments for all these years would end up being taxed. So we probably would have spent our money differently if we'd have known that. So there's all sorts of controversies around those sorts of things. But I think you're right. I think it boils down to an inequality within our society. It seems like Australia particularly prided itself on the middle ground, that our middle class was highly regarded across the world, that there wasn't a large schism between a really uber-rich capitalist elite versus a working class poor that could never get out of there. I think Australia, the great Australian dream of having a little fibro cottage in the suburbs with what did they used to go for, the old Holden FJ Holden in the driveway, and a Hills hoist in the backyard, and mow your lawn on the weekend with a Victor mower. That seems to be the thing that everybody aspired to, and more people are like, well, I don't think I'll even be able to get a unit, let alone a house. So there's a lot of tension around migration with that regard too, the pressures it's putting on our infrastructure and the housing market. So there's a lot of debate that I think are picking up. Like at the core, it's like, who are we as a civilization? Like, how do we answer these questions? And I think as the gospel and the church has been less influential over the popular culture, there seems to be a lot more diverse voices that are emerging to seek to explain inequality in new ways and in different ways, rather than Christian frameworks that maybe we might have used in the past to try and understand some of these issues.
And it seems to be, and I would not profess to be an expert in any of this, but it seems to be happening across three kind of major Western societies in the US, Australia and the UK. They all seem to be experiencing similar yet still slightly different issues about inequality and
I think the same
social
things
mobility.
happen. Yeah, I think the same things happen across Europe, and I think parts of Asia as well. I think Korea and Japan, they're talking about these sorts of things as well. Obviously in Africa there's a lot more problems around these areas too. South Africa is going through a whole issue there. They've also got the added issues of trying to work out their identity post-apartheid. They're still trying to come to terms with some of that. So there's a lot of post-colonial issues going on there too. And
so we're talking, this is our two-part series. We're talking about the practicalities of kind of managing church and how we organise ourselves. So how do we take the ideas we've just talked about, the inequality, into how we organise church? I'm trying to find the link there. It's approaching something differently, isn't it? That maybe you've said people are trying to approach the discussion around inequality differently. How do we approach things differently? Maybe Tim, if you want to go first on this one. What are your thoughts around approaching things differently as we organise ourselves as a church as well, especially when we've got things like this are going on in our culture and society? It obviously changes what happens when people come to the church as well. How do you see that, recognising those issues that exist, but also saying, well, we feel that the gospel helps us stand apart from these issues as well, no matter what time we are in history. Yep. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think theologically first, the first place to go to is Galatians, where there's no longer male, female, Jew or Gentile, slave or free. So all of the worldly, cultural, even biological distinctions that we have between us are we're all equal in terms of adoption into Christ. So none of these are either benefiting or blocking access to being part of God's kingdom.
Yep.
But what's also interesting about all of those is that none of those actually disappear because you become a Christian. So your gender doesn't disappear, your race doesn't disappear, your socioeconomic class doesn't disappear because you become a Christian. So I think what the church does in its expression of Galatians is to say all of us are equal before Christ, and yet no matter where you are in any of those, they're kind of set up as binaries, but obviously we know that they're more spectrums, that you can, we're all together and we can all gather. And this is where I think our strategy and the third place sociology we talk about, one of the key markers of third place is levelling. So for a genuine third place to exist, it's a place where, socioeconomic class, for example, you can all be there at the same time, and the space and what happens in the space levels it out. And so there is no extra benefit to being uber rich when you come to church, or there shouldn't be. And there's no disadvantage for those who are on welfare, at the other end of the spectrum. All of you can come and all of you can partake. And so for us, really practically, what that means is, we've been really careful on the way that we price our meals. And we've talked about this in our hospitality episodes and a number of times on the podcast, but we charge $7 for a meal, $28 for a family. But across the road at South Village, you'd be lucky to feed one person for $28 with the price of food and takeaway and all those kinds of things. So we have reduced the cost to the bare minimum of just covering costs. And we also say to people, hey, if you can't afford to pay, don't pay. It's totally fine. So no one is disadvantaged in that. And we've also had people in our congregation or people who have visited our church who take extra meals home because they can't actually afford meals during the week. And so they take our leftovers and that feeds them during the week. So we want to be generous with our gatherings, with our food as well. So that's a really practical thing. It comes up when we think about camps and youth activities and kids activities. There are families in our congregation who generally can't afford to send their kid on camp. And so we want to think carefully about, okay, so how do we not let that be a barrier to your inclusion in what we actually want to be an all access youth camp, for example, while also acknowledging that actually going away on camp costs money. there are bills to pay when you go away. So those kinds of things. So there's some of the places my mind immediately goes. This fact that there are distinctions. The distinctions are relativized when we come to Christ, because there's no advantage or disadvantage to any of those. And then practically speaking, how we can work amongst that. I suppose probably the other thing is churches right throughout history have been really good at working against inequalities or things that have been seen as unjust. And so, you go back right to the early church of picking up abandoned children and taking them into their homes. You've got Christians who are at the forefront of the hospital systems, schooling systems, university systems, public education. A huge part of the mission expansion through the 18th century was the expansion of education. Reading, writing was really, really key. And so a large part of global education has, you can trace back to missionary movements. So there has always been those kind of things, welfare centres, you've got Anglicare, you've got Wesley Mission, you've got Salvation Army. So all of that has also been Christians trying to notice that there are sometimes disadvantages in society, and what do we have the capacity to do to see God's will done on heaven and on earth, and therefore on earth work towards the flourishing of people that we can. So that's kind of in the mix there as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to think about there. Stu, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of Jesus is absolutely the leveler at church. We intend that to be the case. You're not planning to tape a $5 note to your eyes and poke a few holes in it?
No, not really.
Be an interesting sermon.
Yeah.
No, I use a credit card more than I use cash now. Anyway, so
I wouldn't know how to find cash.
I think it's wonderful to be openly thinking about these issues together, and there'd be a whole podcast series we could delve into in some of these issues. I think really interestingly, even though the community at Acts wasn't prescriptive, there seems to be a context where it was important for the church to encourage families to look after the widows, but where the family couldn't look after the widow, then the church looked after the widow. So there's a responsibility that we have within our context. Each of our local churches seek to do that. I think we always need to keep reflecting on ourselves so that we actually don't become like some of those artists at the Met Gala too, where I think sometimes we've got to be careful we don't become performative when it comes to helping each other and carrying one another's burdens, but we actually do seek to do that. It is exciting to be part of a denomination that we're in with the Anglican Church, that we've got Anglicare that is doing such great work amongst some of those issues. And it is part of, I think, our ministry to be thinking, how do we share the love and truth of Jesus? So while we're very focused as a church on seeking to share the truth of the gospel with people so that they may meet Jesus and they may have an opportunity to become children of God and become people who can live with God in the new heaven, the new earth forever. Revelation 21, so beautiful that there'll be no more crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. So I think as a Reformed evangelical church, we're really focused on the fact that people come to meet Christ through hearing the message that's preached from the Bible. And so that's really primary and really important. But it's also really beautiful that we have an example in Paul, for example, when he was in Thessalonica, and he wrote to the Thessalonians about that experience, and he said, didn't I share the gospel with you and my life? So I think in terms of sharing our life together, I think we do live in a very materialistic world where there are great amounts of inequity, and just being aware of that to seek to be carrying each other's burdens is not communism where we all have to have the same amount of money. However, in Corinthians, Paul's quite scathing about how some of the richer people were behaving as they came to gather each week, because they were getting to church early and their version of the Lord's Supper was to have a meal, and yet they were all sitting there eating and drinking and getting drunk at the meal and eating all the food. And then when all the servants come after they knock off work to come to church, all the food's already eaten, and then they miss out. So there can be a blindness within a local church to what we're actually doing to carry one another's burdens and be a leveller. And yeah, I've had people say to me that Soul Revival could do better, and I think we could. So, that I think there's always that. In terms of running the church with that as a really good basis, I think the other side of the Met Gala thing for me is that we as Christians are using a lot of tools in our churches. We're using a lot of business acumen. We're using a lot of internet software. We're using AI now. We're using all these things. And I suppose the challenge for me is, and it does relate to this area of being a leveller, but it's also, for me, how do we use those tools in our project management of our church, but not actually become business-like in our values? How do we hold on to our Christian values and use these tools? And so it's not a case of don't use any business acumen as we run the church. I think it's really helpful to be using calendars and rosters and rostering programs. We use a program called ChurchSuite, which is terrific. So yeah, I suppose the other thought in my mind for today's episode is, how do we be effective and efficient without worshipping effectiveness and efficiency? How do we be a church that can be a bit messy, but it can also be seeking to do everything as well as we can to the glory of God as well?
Yeah, and I hear what I hear both of you saying is we want to maintain a Jesus-inspired Christian culture, not so much in a nationalistic sense, but in a societal sense, but in terms of what are we doing at church to make this a place where people do feel the truth and love of Jesus. Stu mentioned ChurchSuite there, for example. Tim, is there anything else that you kind of think, some systems that actually help with that we wanted to make this episode practical and things, talk about certain things that we do. Is there any you're a very avid user of ChurchSuite, which is great. It's very helpful. I get the very helpful emails when I'm on the kids' rosters.
Yep.
Anything else though, in terms of, you can talk about ChurchSuite, but anything else that you like to use that helps us maintain that Christian culture?
Yeah, well, I think any church above 5 people in a lounge room probably needs some sort of, managing what you do together. And so, you do need to know calendars. You need to know rosters. You need to know when people are away on holidays and when they're around, who's willing to do what ministry. And so, we all need tools to help us manage these kinds of things. And, obviously, computer programs have not been around for centuries. So there are other ways of doing it other than software. But one of the
tablet,
tablet
pigeons instead of emails.
Yeah, that's right.
I'd like to have a go at that.
Yeah. Send a pigeon.
Yeah, send me a pigeon.
That's to increase my pigeon budget. But so there are lots of ways of doing this, but this is where it is. You're not purposefully rejecting technology just for the sake of being anti-tech. So there are lots of really helpful programs, and we've found ChurchSuite to be one. We've pushed it beyond its capacity in a few different areas. We keep trying to jerry-rig it and work out how we can make it do things it was never designed to do. And so, but it's fun to do that, but it's also really helpful because it does communicate well. And again, we need clarity for people. We need clarity for ourselves. If I'm going to lead a service well on the weekend, I need to know that all the people I've delegated to have accepted the delegation, will be there, and will let me know if they're not. They're all important things. It's not a helpful gathering. It's not a orderly, appropriate gathering that is able to focus on God and the worship of Him as Lord and Saviour and hear His word read to us and experience and explore that together in word and song and preaching. Unless, if there's a stress about, whether the delegations will actually happen. So, these things, is important to have these systems in place. And so, so they're one of the main things. Text messaging, I think one of the struggles we sometimes have with organising different generations in an all-age, all-stage church is that different generations tend towards different technologies that they're comfortable with or prefer to use. And
pigeons.
Sorry?
Pigeons.
Some people prefer pigeons still. Yep. Smoke signals. Others.
Imagine if we actually had people doing that.
But so some people, they have preferred messaging systems. That, if it's not on WhatsApp, it didn't happen. Whereas other people use Facebook Messenger, but some people don't have Facebook's accounts, and some people just like texts on their phone. Some people never check their email. Or my daughter the other day, she goes, "Oh, you should have sent me a reminder that I was on Kids." And I said, I did. There's the original email. There's the email that comes out that week. And she said, "Oh yeah, I see emails from all these alert emails, and I just select all and delete." And I was like, "Well, that's a you problem, not a me problem."
It's like shooting the pigeon before it even lands.
But again, being a much younger generation, email for her is not intuitive,
it's
it's
different,
not. It's very different. But again, we sort of live in a time where text messaging through a computer system usually requires accounts and money, and so that's financially it's free if I do it, but that's me personally having to text everyone one for one. So there's all these sort of things that we have to work through. But we are trying to use good systems in a way that is all gearing towards, especially on our weekend gatherings, which is the high point of our week, as we always talk about, the gathering of God's people around God's word for the glory and praise of God and the benefit of His saints. That's what we're doing, and there's lots of other parts of that, but we want our gatherings to be God-centered, other person beneficial, accessible to those who are outside, missional conversations, all of those kinds of things going on. And to do that well requires good systems.
So can I get your take on systems as well? Because even like something like ChurchSuite, which we use quite heavily as a staff team, but people that aren't on staff, there's a different uptake in that, for example, and so some people can get a bit frustrated that that's the only way we communicate or organise. How do you see that in a way that's,
I think
that's loving?
they're really good questions. I think try and be as diverse as we can. Try and listen to the young people when they tell us that they're not using emails anymore, but at the same time asking them to also be part of building a bridge to a new reality. That, you know, we've worked with old technology, but technology changes so quickly that each 5 years there's a new technology, and the kids who grow up with that era want that technology. So I remember when kids were saying to us, "Oh, why can't we use Snapchat instead of emails? Because we all use Snapchat." But now no one uses Snapchat anymore. And anyway, what's the point of Snapchat? You can't even see the text after it's been seen, it disappears or whatever. So if we just take on ideas, like the shock absorber theory helps us to think through, is just taking on all of the ideas of young people without some kind of filter is going to mean that we're too flexible, and a shock absorber that's too flexible will break. But the balance is, if we insist on everyone having emails, then that's too rigid. We do need to, and it's part of the fun of the approach, isn't it? It's the walking the path between flexibility and a bit of structure. So, but we have people in our church still who don't have a computer. So we have some of our saints in their 90s who we print off the newsletter each week still for them as well. So you just want to see if you can, I guess it comes back to that similar idea of loving people where they're at, as well as seeking to organise things. But what fascinates me, and I don't know what you two think, is the conversation around some of these things have actually gone beyond just the tools that we're using and how we use those tools to actually a bit more of a meta idea of what is an efficient way to run a church is. And I'm fascinated seeing people now questioning roles in the church that have just been very static for many generations. Roles like, what is a pastor, and how should a pastoral team effectively run a church these days? And so there's an efficiency coefficient that gets explored in some models, the purpose-driven models of the 5 M's, for example, where instead of having a generalist pastor, let's have a pastor who's responsible for ministry areas, and then those areas are looked after across different gatherings. There is the other side of things, which is you just have a generalist pastor, and that generalist pastor has to be able to do all those different areas. So they have to be able to make sure the music happens and the Bible studies and the welcoming and et cetera, et cetera. There's an in-between, which I think we are, a bit of an in-between, where we have generalist pastors who also have specific areas of ministry responsibility as well. So I'm finding that a fascinating conversation. And I'm sure it's got another little while to go as we work that out together in Australia. But there's definitely, quite strong arguments for each 3 of those different approaches from Scripture. But it's really exciting and fun to see people having different models that are engaging with different ideas and debating different practices. I think that's a fun thing.
Well, one of the question I've got there is that, that's an interesting idea in itself. And it made me think of, when you were saying that, of recently Live Golf, the Saudi Arabian funded golf tournament.
Yep.
The Saudi Arabia Public Investment Fund, which is what they use to invest in all these different things, has withdrawn their money, and they've just they spent billions of dollars on it. And there's also the golfers who have switched from the PGA Tour to the Live thing and now trying to get back, but they have to give up a whole lot of earnings that they'll earn in the PGA Tour if they were just on PGA.
It's kind of like the Super League in NRL back in the 90s and 2000s.
It's a little bit like that, yeah. And the Saudi Arabian Wealth Fund have invested in many things, one of them including Newcastle United in the Premier League. There's the Formula 1 track that they built and have started having a race there for a while. So what that has actually done is forced the PGA now, because Live is now almost defunct. It still exists, but they've taken away a lot of the funding for it. And one of the ways that they presented it was it's the fun way of doing golf. Like they had DJs and a whole lot of parties around it. So you can see there's one
like
from
Big Bash cricket.
Yeah, it's similar to that. There's one like
people on BMX bikes.
Yeah, I think it might have been an event in
areas.
Adelaide or somewhere where they've just this huge DJ set that's going on. But what's it done is, now that it's almost defunct, it's forced the PGA to innovate. And a lot of commentators are saying, the PGA needs to pick up their game in these kind of areas. Tim, I was going to ask you a question in regards to that. Do you have a scenario or an idea or a way that that's happened at church? So someone has even maybe brought an idea and that's really challenged what has gone on before, and then you've either changed it or chosen not to change it.
Ooh, that's a good question. Let me try and think.
That's a tough question, though.
It is a tough question. I'll think. Stu, you got any ideas?
Or how would you approach it?
How would you approach it?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the shock absorber, we usually talk about it generationally, but it works in all circumstances, which is we want to be adaptable to people, but also firm and mature on why we have the systems that we have. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that will regularly come up is that people who have experience in other churches want to bring some of the ideas, the events, the culture, the systems that they've used at other churches and say, hey, this worked well at my last church. Why don't we do this as Soul Revival? And those conversations can go in a number of different ways. And we try to use the shock absorber in that. And we try to use the shock absorber theory to say, okay, I want to respond to you. I want you to tell me what you found helpful about that and explore that with you. And so that's listening to the other person, while also not necessarily giving up the structures that we've really thoughtfully thought through in terms of theology, strategy, practice. And so allowing that shock absorbing to happen by the interaction of those two things. So the two extremes are, I'll just do whatever you want to do because I've got no idea why we do things as a church, so I guess we can just do whatever you want to do. And you end up with this, mix and pick and mix, vision of church where you just kind of do everyone's good idea. The far too rigid version is, no, we know Soul Revival, you can't give us any new idea that we would ever take on. So we want to avoid both of those because that's either too flexible or too hard. We want to be shock absorbing, we want to be mature in the middle there. So someone from one of our gatherings, Sunday morning gathering, has said, I found it helpful at other churches when we have particular prayer nights and we spend some time dedicated to pray. And we've affirmed and said, yes, it is great when churches pray. We love praying together. We want to be putting prayer more and more on the agenda. Their perception of what goes on has not noticed as much prayer. And we go, that's interesting. You haven't noticed that because here's a few things we are already doing. But we also want to respond to that. But part of the Soul Revival mature structure that knows our theology, strategy and practice says, well, actually what we're trying to avoid is adding extra nights and extra events. One of the things we try and do is to say, no, when we gather together over the weekend at our gatherings, it's all of that time around the gatherings, the befores, the afters, the late nights, the chill, all of that time is where we really want to do the life of community and the life of discipleship together. So rather than adding another event to a calendar, we want to make the most use of the time we're already spending together. And so part of the answer we think, we haven't actually implemented yet, but one of the answers we think is, on our Sunday morning gatherings, we have breakfast, we have gathering, we have morning tea, and then we have people just still hanging out till they go home. Somewhere in that post-gathering time, what if we more regularly gather people together in one of the spaces and say, hey, if you just want to hang out and do morning tea, you're very welcome. But if you want to intentionally spend some time praying and asking God for needs of the community, needs of your friends, evangelism opportunities, mission in your workplace, neighbourhood, whatever it is, we're going to go over here and we're going to give significant time to that. And so that has been trying to adapt, trying to hear from a sister who has a great idea, but also use the maturity of our structures to say, let's honour what you're noticing and what you're seeing, try and implement a new, it's not really new, but it's a newish or more regular idea within the maturity of the structures that we have. And so that's been one real clear example where we've tried to exhibit that shock absorbing with a new idea.
As part of that shock absorber framework that we love to talk about, obviously, which
it's the name of the podcast.
Yeah, it's the name of the podcast. Stu, how do you say no to a good idea?
We'll come back to the example Tim's talking about. It's a conversation. I think that's what Tim's engaged in with that. And in a conversation with the person who's got the new idea and a conversation with our theological perspective and a conversation with our tradition. So we kind of, Matt Redmond years ago, one of our pastors, one of our founding pastors, drew a triangle and said, we've got the Bible at the top of the triangle, we've got our tradition at the bottom left of the triangle, and then we've got cultural change and new ideas at the right-hand side. And he was saying it's a conversation between all of those. And at the end of the day, we want to think theologically. There are other models for that I've been using too, like the practical theology model of pastoral cycle, which is another way of dealing with these kind of questions, like what's happening, why is it happening, what does the Bible say, and what could be a new outcome. So at each of those points of that conversation, there's an interaction between those elements. And so I think what Tim was really helpfully unpacking there was a process of project management. It's like, okay, here's an idea, what do we do with that? Me listening on, I've thought of some other things that I think might be worth thinking about in that context too, and that's part of what's really good about being in a team. Not everyone has a ministry team that they can be a part of, but in that conversation, my mind went straight away to the fact that in the very early days of Soul Revival, Mercy Adello taught us to pray, and we met with this lady who'd been praying for us in an afternoon before church one week, and we started praying with her at about 3:00 in the afternoon in one of the church halls. And when I opened my eyes, it was dark. It was amazing. I'd never had that kind of a prayer time before. And we asked Mercia, how do you feel that we can take that experience of prayer that we've just had and implement that across our community? And she suggested having a prayer night for each of the youth groups once a term. And so that was a different approach to the weekly prayer time on a Wednesday night, or even another slightly different to having people pray after church. I think there's lots of different ways of doing it, and trying different ways is fun. But in my mind, I'm also thinking the Sunday morning gathering that we have hasn't experienced that once a term prayer experience very strongly yet. And we're trying to implement that through a thing we call the Commitments Week, because in Commitments Week we have the first week of prayer, and the second week we encourage people to ask a friend to church. Now, as many people say, well, every week should be ask a friend to church. But yeah, just doing it once a term, we found it quite helpful to remember to pray for our lost brothers and sisters and our family and our friends. And then just think, even if I don't ask them to church on the weekend, I might spend the week praying for them, so that I might even in Bible study on during the week pray for them. I might even get together with a few parishioners, and the church doesn't have to organise a prayer night. We could just get together and pray if we want to do it. So the idea of having prayer after church once every now and again is also a good idea. The only downside of that is sometimes, as Tim knows, sometimes the people who are the most mature Christians straight after church, instead of having morning tea, or go off by themselves in a corner, and the new people who've just arrived are like holding a cup of tea going, oh, what's going on with that?
Yep.
And there's a holy huddle over there I wasn't invited to because I don't really understand. So I was told by an assistant pastor of ours at Guymer Anglican Church, when we used to do a similar thing after church on Sunday nights, he asked us not to, actually, and it's a similar version of what we're talking about now. Tim Foster said, it's actually more spiritual to be here to minister to people after the service than it is to go and pray at this moment. Now, we had a big debate about that at the time because he made it a bit of a binary question. But I think he was just trying to get us to think, and I really appreciated that. So, yeah, balancing all those experiences of community and church is really, really fun, because it's like, I'm open to having my mind changed. Oh, I'll share this, I learnt this, tried this didn't work. But why don't we give that a go and see if that same problem happens again? I remember earlier on in Soul Revival, we were really into music and really into Christian music. But one of the shadows of that we didn't expect is some of the bands we encouraged to grow up in our church then went and played in pubs. And then they were regularly asking members of Soul Revival to go on a Saturday night to the pub to go and support them in a gig rather than be it solely. So we stopped encouraging Christian bands for a while, not to stop people forming bands, but we thought it's kind of like our community gave birth to a band, and it makes sense for that band to then say, well, this is my core group of people that support my band. It makes sense for them to take them out of the ministry on a Saturday night to support them at a gig. But it actually did reduce the amount of ministry we could do on a Saturday night because most of our mature Christians had gone out to support this band sort of thing. So, yeah, I think it's iterative design. I think it's all about trying new things. But what we like to do at Soulies is we talk about building a bridge to a new reality so that if it doesn't work, we can come back to where we were. So in my thought is, if this was a staff meeting and you were all listening in on it, I'd probably say, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. If you guys want to have a pray, think of that as a consequence that you might be taking people out. But also remember, we haven't really had a really good prayer service once a term yet in Sunday morning. And maybe when we start doing that, people will go, wow, this is actually using the church service for what the church service should be doing. Why do we have to export discipleship and mission and prayer off the church service? Like we've got an opportunity in our church service to have a week where we have prayer every week. And I think a lot of people don't see it as prayer. Like someone gets up the front and prays, but they somehow don't feel like that's prayer. But what we are, well, they know it's prayer, but they don't feel like they're praying maybe because there's someone praying on their behalf. But I do think in some of the Anglican churches I've seen, we do a lot of prayer in Anglican churches. There's a lot of talking to God that I think people think, oh, because it's in the church service, that's church. We should do prayer separate to that to actually have a real good prayer ministry. But my thought is if once a term we actually have someone pray and lead us in prayer, but then we spend time in small groups praying within the church service, I think that would be fantastic. And we haven't really explored that enough yet in our services. But that's almost like taking that old idea of Mercia where we used to have a prayer night once a term for youth group where the whole night was turned over to prayer and the teenagers would come and just pray. People used to challenge that and say, oh, teenagers aren't going to want to pray for a whole night. No one will come. But I can tell you that some of the biggest nights we've had in the 90s were prayer nights. And it was just a wonderful experience seeing young people praying and even non-Christian kids just coming along and listening and trying to understand what we're doing and seeing what Christianity is all about. So, yeah, some people might say, oh, but if we have prayer in a service, we might not be able to do everything else we do in a normal service if we spend more time praying. And I'm like, well, I think it might be nice once a term to set aside most of the service, still have a sermon, still have a Bible reading, still have singing, but spend more time praying together would be really good. So, yeah, that's an example of how we might build a bridge to a new reality, because we might say, well, let's start off with the service. We're not actually we'd be ruining the morning tea by that, but we might limit the amount of interaction with new people if that did happen. So why don't we actually spend more time in the service doing it? And if it doesn't work out that is a good space, then we can come back to what we are now and then build a bridge to maybe a prayer night or a other things. So, yeah, I think that way of putting the Bible first is really helpful as we work out what traditions to continue, what do we learn from not only our own traditions within our own little church, but also traditions from the past of Christendom, and how do we engage with culture. And one last thing I'd say on that is the idea of the shock absorber is your initial question on how do we interface with culture. There's been a lot written about how young people, because they're in school, are actually immersed in friendships with secular people at school. And so they understand cultural change quickly because they're actually at the forefront of that. And so what young people have are secular friends who are called cultural hosts. So those cultural hosts help those Christian kids to learn what's going on in the secular culture. And in our model, we then take those young people who have learnt that new secular culture and we make them cultural hosts for the adults in the church who don't have that weekly interaction with young people in school. And the really fascinating thing from the literature is that our instinct to use friendships as a way of facilitating those cultural host relationships is what the literature says is the best way to help ideas flow through healthy intergenerational host relationships where kids can be cultural hosts to adults because they're friends. So that's why having morning tea or dinners at church or whatever else we might have, our hope is those spaces will intentionally, not just hopefully it'll happen, but we also try and intentionally bring generations together so they get to know each other so that adults can benefit from that new wisdom.
I love that, and I've benefited from a lot of that wisdom in my time.
Well, I've benefited from you in that because you've taught me so much.
That's very kind you say that too. And I think that's true. That happens a lot across our church.
And what's great now is your kids are now teaching me things.
Yes.
Which is very exciting.
Yeah, that is very lovely.
Because they're like my spiritual grandchildren that are now teaching me. They're cultural hosts to me still.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about, but really cool. I love that. There was the final thing I wanted to ask you guys about, and talking about the practicalities of organising ourselves. So this week we had our council meeting where everyone from that leads a ministry meets together. And I had a great meeting in the communications. It was we have a small team, but it was the biggest one we'd ever had, which was unreal, and I had a lot of fun. But I wanted to get you guys' thoughts on this, and it was something you actually, I think, Stu, you might have said it to me after the last week's episode. It was something we like to do, and something that's really important to me is teams, not tasks. So, Tim, can I get your quick fire thoughts on teams over tasks? Because at Soul Revival, even if it's a new ministry and we think we will do it, we won't do it unless we can build a team around it, for example. So go for it. Why do you think teams, not tasks, is important?
Yes, this is a practical outworking of our high value of friendship, both as a theological category, but also as a strategic value that we put friendship and relationship first. So it's more important that we are friends together, friends with Jesus, and therefore, because of Jesus, friends with each other, doing something together than just getting a task done. And so, we try and express that. Even when the way we do meetings, we try and express the fact that we are friends together. And so therefore there is, there's a levity to the meeting sometimes. There is joyfulness, there's sharing of life together.
A lot of jokes.
It can be food.
Yeah.
There's lots of ways that we can express that we are here to be friends together, and this is going to sound really cold, but utilising the friendship in order to get the task done. But
wow.
to strip the
that seems very utilitarian.
Yeah, I know.
Thanks for this podcast.
Who asked this bloke to come on the podcast?
German efficiency.
Very efficient.
Yes, I did.
No, we're
phrase it was going to be.
We know what you're saying.
Utilitarian.
We know what you're saying.
But it is genuinely...
The friendship is a driver.
Friendship is a driver, yes. And this is where it protects itself against utilitarianism, is that where it's not just a utility, it's actually an inbuilt value. So it's a theological conviction, it's a strategic value, and we put that into practice not because we think that if you're nice to each other, you'll get better things done. Like that then starts to get corporate and utilitarian. Is I guess I have to be nice to Joel, because if I'm nice to Joel, then we're going to have a better podcast. We actually believe that we'll get a better podcast because we are really good friends with each other first and foremost. And that goes all the way down to our communications team, children's ministry team, life support team, whatever it is that we're doing. I want to be friends with those in my team, not as a utility, but as a theological conviction, because our relationship with each other is one of the driving energy of the way we are convicted that good ministry happens. And so, yes, that's what protects it from being a utilitarian, more, I guess, was it virtue ethics? I don't know what it is. So that's really key. So teams before tasks is an active outworking of our theology and strategy of friendship.
You want to talk about teams as well, Stu? I've learned so much about being in a team.
Oh, no, I think Tim summarised it really well. I think, just one extra thing. I think that idea of being friends in a team is something we're still trying to work out. I think sometimes people come to meetings and they're very task focused and they want things to be efficient. And so the meeting you were mentioning on Wednesday night, I was making a few jokes from up the front, and I know one of my friends who loves me very much and I love him very much, but he was just rolling his eyes like Stu's just wasting time. Here he goes again with his crazy story or whatever it might be. Yeah, and then when I started digging into some of the practicalities of using ChurchSuite as a team, there were other friends of mine who were rolling their eyes going, oh, this is why I don't come to this meeting, this is so boring. Get back to the fun. So I think it's kind of challenging to be loving and it sort of comes all full circle back to what we're saying at the beginning of the podcast, actually, to be including different kinds of people in a meeting takes a bit of a social IQ to try and judge how to it. There's a lot of nuance, but then there's also hopefully over time we create a culture that people can have fun and get stuff done at the same time. And so people who are busy and have been working all day don't come to church on a Wednesday night to a meeting and have to work for another 2 hours, because that's what it can sometimes feel like. Now, sure, we've got to get stuff done sometimes, and some people love making a list of things to talk about and then actioning those things and all that sort of stuff. But I think there's a real value in loving one another, that we're coming to share the love of Jesus when we gather in a meeting, and communicate verbally is also, I think, a dying art. I think people are getting more and more digital, that if it's not written down, or it's not in an email, or it's not in an SMS, or it's not a text message, they don't know how to operate. So civilizations for centuries have gathered around a fire and just said, I reckon we go get a mammoth tomorrow. Who's keen? Yeah, I'm keen, but I just chipped my old spear top and I have to go and make another spear top. And then someone goes, oh, you're always chipping your spear tops. Why don't you actually use it properly? Well, if someone had taught me how to use it, I'd be able to use it. So in those days, they used to have the same problems, but they didn't have a to-do list and an action plan that came out of it. So sometimes I think it's good to actually hold on to some of that humanness, that we don't become too industrialized, I think. So that's why I'm pursuing this friendship in team thing, because it is more human to actually value each other as people, not just for what people can produce. And so the whole acumen of industrialization is, you mean something to me because you're a human resource that has an output that benefits me. But if I'm actually just not getting benefited from you, other than a laugh at your joke or spending time with you, and and it's not only joking and laughing and positive, it can also be negative stuff, where I've been in a team meeting that someone's just poured out their heart that they're just really not coping in life, and all of a sudden we're praying for the whole meeting instead of getting the task done. And then someone will always say, who's got a gift for being organised, well, that was a waste of time. We ended up not getting this project done. And I was in a meeting once where someone said, well, let's not do it. And we all went, yeah, why did we have to do it anyway? Let's not do it. Cool. Why don't we just hang out on the weekend? Doesn't matter that we haven't got anything planned. Now, you can't live every week like that, but when those sort of moments happen, obviously that was now 25 years ago that night happened, and I still remember it. How many meetings have I been to that I don't remember? So what was it about that? I don't know. It was very nice to be a part of that moment where we carried someone's burdens. So yeah, I don't know if that helps or just opens up more questions really, but I don't know what you think, Tim.
Well, and it goes back to what we were saying last week about how the way we want to do church management is relational, because God is relational and we're relational. And so we want to step back from anything that starts to leak into those metaphors of industrializations and corporate kind of things, because they depersonalize relationships. And so what was needed right then was to stop and pray with that person and cancel the plans for the weekend, because that was the responsive, relational, incarnate need at that particular point in time, and that's where the team rather than the task was the most important thing. So I think that's absolutely flowing with what we're talking about. I think probably maybe another tangent, another caveat, I know we're trying to wrap up, but is the God gives different people different personalities as well, and that there's a good humanness to the fact that we're all made differently. And so for some people who, not out of an over-industrialization, but just because of the way God has given them, will be more task-oriented than relational maybe, it's part of loving them and actually loving them in the team, in the midst of being a good friend for them, to actually give them good outputs in the terms of the team as well. So that's another sort of thing we have to balance in here as well is, we're all about relationships so that we don't care if things get done. It might actually be an unloving thing to someone else in our community who's been given different gifts, different skills, blessed by the Spirit in different ways, and can contribute something else to our ministry that we might lack. And so just like, extroverts need introverts and they need to come together and work out how things to do different. There's all these different scales of, ways we can rate personality. And I think one other danger just to sort of flag is we want to be careful not to sanctify a particular personality trait. We need to recognise that actually there are a multitude of ways that God has gifted the church. But part again of being relational and responsive to the people in your team is honouring who is there and loving them in different ways. And so we will do that because we're putting teams, not tasks first, as part of our organisation.
I remember, Stu, something that you said, might have been on a podcast maybe a year or so ago, and it was in relation to Ministry Slide, which we referred back to in the last episode, was that you mean more to us than what you can give us. And I think I've found that really helpful in terms of leading my particular ministry. And I think that's a really good way to look at it. Is we don't want people to burn out, but we want to be friends with them. We want to be relational, and for them, their relationship with God is more important than just completing a task, I suppose. So I think that's a good way to sum up. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Joel.
Talk
it's
about
good fun.
Practicalities. Yeah, I appreciate it. If you did appreciate it, that's awesome. And thank you for listening and getting all the way to the end. We really appreciate you engaging with what we have to say. You can email me, joel@shockabsorber.com.au, if you want to continue the conversation, or you can visit the Shock Absorber website at shockabsorber.com.au and join our mailing list for the Shock Absorber Network. But with that, we will say thank you to everyone listening and watching, and thank you to Tim, and thank you to Stu.
Thank you, Joel.
It's been a very fun podcast, and we'll finish with a one way.
One way.
One way.
One way.